Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In my opening statement, I made the point that the problem you've all identified with some consistency still can't be based on who we like or dislike, and the testimony certainly highlighted the point that I tried to make. Also, in reference to the statement that was just made about the IRS has just lost 27,000 employees. I'm wondering if there's anybody left working down there to undertake these sophisticated audits that have to take place about foreign intervention. And I also think that it was not stated, but I think that in briefings I've had over the years, there's been, particularly from former Speaker Pelosi, she raised the question many times about contributions to universities and how that plays out. I hope part of the focus as we go forward would be part of that. So I want to ask you a quick question, and maybe a yes or no answer would be appropriate. Let's start on the right to the left, and if you could just give me a yes or no before I come back to a couple of questions that I have. Is the $400 million jet problematic?
Yes.
Today, we're taking a closer look at a recent Senate hearing that's been getting a lot of attention, both for the substance of what was discussed and for the way lawmakers approached the issue. If you're new to the channel, welcome to 45th Perspective, where we try to slow things down, unpack the noise, and look at politics with clarity and nuance. If you find this breakdown helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really does support the channel. And if you'd like to go a step further, you can join our community on Patreon at patreon.com/45thPerspective.
Yes.
On its face, I don't have enough information, but I would certainly, it's suspect in my opinion.
I feel that topic of the committee I thought was on nonprofits, so I don't think I have the sufficient information to answer that question.
Thank you for that question. Very similar answer. I was brought as a witness to examine loopholes in our campaign finance system, of which the Qatar jet was not, so I'm unable to opine on this subject.
Yeah, and I too am not properly qualified as an expert in that sort of law.
So thanks for reinforcing the point that I made in my opening statement. Mr. Weissman, as you know, the Presidential Library, a tax-exempt charity, has received and accepts gifts from foreign governments, including a $400 million luxury plane from Qatar. It's been reported that Qatar received $142 billion in an arms deal. So do you have any explanation as to why a $400 million jet would be given to the president?
I think the explanation is the obvious one. They were seeking to win influence with the president, and I think they succeeded at doing so.
Thank you. And let me follow up, Mr. Weissman. Yesterday, the Washington Post reported that a federal judge is reviewing the legality of private donors funding the ballroom. I don't even have to say which ballroom. We all know which ballroom I'm referencing. Without objection, I'd like to enter the Washington Post article into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Weissman, what is known about the ballroom's funding and the Freedom 250 projects?
Well, we have some idea of who's funding the ballroom, not complete, and maybe there are others that we do not know. We were able to analyze the 24 known corporate donors at the early stages of the ballroom. 16 of them had government contracts going back over the last 5 years, totaling $270 billion in federal contracts. My view is they were funding the ballroom not out of a sense of civic pride, but out of a sense of they can get something back in return. A couple of those companies, as you mentioned in your statement, are domestic subsidiaries of foreign businesses. I think as we look now to the Freedom 250 project, which seems to be a comparable fundraising effort, we're going to see the same kind of problem. Lots of money from businesses with business before the United States government, including potentially subsidiaries of foreign businesses. And by the way, because these are going to be through C3 operations, we are not going to know who all the funders are unless there's an affirmative decision by the nonprofits linked to the president to disclose them.
So let's get into it. This hearing was centered on a question that's becoming increasingly urgent: how the federal government should navigate a growing fiscal strain while balancing competing demands from states, cities, and taxpayers. Senators pressed witnesses, particularly local officials, on how they plan to handle budget shortfalls, whether through spending cuts, new revenue sources, or pressure on state-level leaders to adjust their own tax policies. The tone was serious, sometimes tense, because what they're discussing isn't abstract. It's about public services, affordability, and long-term financial stability for millions of Americans. One of the standout exchanges came when a senator asked, very directly, whether local leaders would be willing to raise property taxes if state governments refused to consider raising taxes on high-income earners. The question wasn't just procedural, it was meant to force clarity. And the response, while firm, highlighted the complexity of the moment. The witness made it clear that raising property taxes is not the preferred option. They argued that the property tax system is outdated, imbalanced, and in dire need of reform. But they also pointed out a basic reality. It's the one major tax a city can adjust without state approval. So the conversation became less about ideology and more about what a city is realistically left with when its hands are tied. That's the tension running through this entire hearing. On one side, you have lawmakers who insist that raising taxes on high earners or corporations risks pushing investment out of the state or discouraging economic growth. Their argument rests on the idea that competitiveness matters, and if a state is already expensive, additional tax burdens could have long-term consequences. They also emphasize fiscal discipline, arguing that before taxes are raised, local governments should be pressed to eliminate waste, streamline agencies, and prioritize essential services. On the other side, you have those who believe that the wealthiest residents and the most profitable companies are in the best position to contribute more during a fiscal crisis. They argue that economic inequality has been widening for years, and that revenue from the top can help stabilize budgets without placing additional burdens on working families or small homeowners. They also note that when services decline, public transit, sanitation, education, those costs fall disproportionately on ordinary people, not on the wealthy. What I found most interesting in this hearing was the way both sides acknowledged the crisis but diverged sharply on what a fair contribution looks like. Senators pressed witnesses to explain whether they'd be willing to make politically unpopular decisions, and the witnesses pushed back by arguing that local governments shouldn't be forced to make those decisions alone. You could sense the frustration. City officials feel they're being boxed in. State officials argue they're already stretched thin. And ordinary Americans are watching, wondering which level of government is actually going to take responsibility. There's also the larger political context to consider. This is an election year for several key state positions, and tax policy becomes even more sensitive when candidates are calculating how every stance might affect their prospects. When governors or state legislators say they won't raise taxes on millionaires or corporations, part of that is policy belief, but part of it is pure political calculus. No one wants to give their opponents an easy attack line. But when local governments are facing multi-billion-dollar gaps, hard choices become unavoidable. That disconnect, the political incentives at the state level versus the financial pressures at the local level, is at the heart of the debate. Now, here's where my own perspective comes in. I think it's important to recognize that no single policy choice can solve a structural budget crisis. Property taxes alone can't do it, especially if the system is outdated. Wealth taxes alone won't magically close long-term gaps without broader fiscal reforms. Spending cuts, if done recklessly, risk harming the very people the government is supposed to serve. So instead of looking for one silver bullet, what we saw in this hearing was a clash of priorities. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Healthy tension can produce better policy if officials are willing to compromise. But the danger is that political pressure pushes leaders to avoid the hard conversations altogether. When that happens, the burden shifts silently onto ordinary residents. Transit delays, school overcrowding, slower emergency response times, deteriorating infrastructure. The effects don't announce themselves with a press conference. They just quietly become part of daily life. That's why hearings like this matter. They force these questions into public view, even if the answers aren't clean or comfortable. Another key point raised during the hearing is that long-term structural issues, like outdated tax formulas or inconsistent state-city funding relationships, can't be fixed through short-term patches. Several witnesses emphasized that while they're willing to take temporary measures, they want state leaders to play a role in systemic reform. That's a reasonable request. After all, local governments operate within systems they didn't design and can't completely control. If those systems are contributing to the fiscal strain, then avoiding reform isn't just unhelpful, it's irresponsible. At the same time, local governments have to be transparent about their own budgeting practices. Constantly pointing upward, toward the state, can distract from internal inefficiencies. One positive takeaway from the hearing is that witnesses acknowledged this. They admitted the property tax system needs to be modernized and that they are preparing legislative proposals to address it. That kind of honesty, recognizing both external constraints and internal shortcomings, creates the groundwork for real progress. So where does all this leave ordinary Americans? It leaves them waiting to see whether their leaders can navigate a difficult but necessary conversation without retreating into talking points. People want stability. They want a functioning city or state that doesn't lurch from crisis to crisis. And most importantly, they want leaders who acknowledge that the choices they make have real consequences for real communities. As we wrap up, I want to thank you for spending this time here at 45th Perspective. These issues aren't simple and they're not always exciting, but they shape the world we live in every day. If you found this breakdown helpful, remember to like and subscribe, and consider supporting the channel on Patreon at patreon.com/45thPerspective. And now I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think local governments should raise property taxes if the state won't act? Should high-income earners and corporations contribute more? Or is the real problem structural, requiring a deeper overhaul? Share your perspective in the comments, and as always, keep the conversation respectful.